Hey guys, here we are with water properties or properties of water, lecture 2 or 2.2.2. All right, continue with our lecture on water. And the first thing we want to talk about are a couple of terms, solvent, solute, and solution. Remember, the solvent is the solution or is the material in which the solute is being dissolved in. And water is a great solvent. It's a great solvent because of its polar nature. And as you can see in this picture right here, the solute, which is sodium chloride or table salt, is being pulled apart by the polar water molecules. As you can see, chlorine has a negative charge, sodium has a positive charge, and the negatively charged side of the water molecule, the oxygen, is attracted to this positive sodium ion, while the positively charged parts of the water molecule, those white hydrogens, are attracted to the negative chlorine molecule. So what we have here, of course, is water being the solvent, sodium chloride being the solute, and together they form a solution once we see an equal distribution of those sodium and chlorine ions in that solvent in water. And again, all has to do with water's polar nature. Okay? A couple of other things is we all should realize that water is does act as a solvent, and it will dissolve substances that are hydrophilic, but it will not dissolve substances that are hydrophobic. And remember, hydro means water, phobia means fear. So things such as oil, as shown in this glass, or as we did in our lab the other day, will not mix with water. And of course, this can have disastrous results when we are extracting energy in watery environments and we get an accident which results in an oil spill. And here, of course, we can see a duck that is covered with oil and it will not survive. Salt, on the other hand, is hydrophilic, and we just saw that earlier slide because water is the salt is attracted to the water. Again, the positive sodium to the negative oxygen on the water molecule, and the negative chlorine to the positively charged parts of the water molecule or the hydrogen. Okay, water has this property we call dissociation. We start off with our water molecule H2O, and it will automatically on its own split into these hydroniums and hydroxyls. Okay, the hydronium or the proton, the H plus, is a positively charged ion, and it is what makes an acid an acid. Acids are based on the concentration of those protons. When we see that H plus, we don't call them hydrogens, we call them protons. Why? Because it lost its electron, and hydrogen doesn't have any neutrons, so when it loses its electrons, all it has is a proton left. So we just call it protons, and they're extremely important in biology. And then when water does split in half, okay, we have the hydroxyl group, the OH, that is a negative charge, and we have the positively charged proton. And water is neutral on the pH scale because the OH group is what makes a base, and the protons are what makes an acid an acid, and they equal out each other. They balance in pure water. There's this equal number of the hydroxyls and an equal number of the protons, so therefore the pH is going to be neutral. And let's go into our pH scale. Once again, the pH scale is based upon the concentration of protons, the H pluses, in a solution. A solution that has a whole bunch of protons is going to be acidic, or I should say a solution that has more protons than hydroxyls is an acid, where a solution that has more hydroxyls, the OH, is going to be a base. It's going to be basic. And as you can see on this chart on the side, the pH scale goes from 0 to 14. And this is a logarithmic scale, meaning that there's 10 times more protons in a solution that has a pH of 6, such as your urine, than pure water or your blood. And black coffee has 10 times more proton concentration than urine does. And so black coffee is actually 10 times 10 or 100 times more acidic than pure water. Again, there's a difference of 10 between each one of these numbers. So tomato juice would be 10 times 10 times 10, or it would be 1,000 times more acidic. And vinegar, beer, or wine would be 10,000 times more acidic. Your stomach acid or juice, lemon juice, would be 100,000 times more acidic, and so on and so on. Again, based on the concentration of the hydrogen ions within a substance. Here's another picture of the pH scale. I kind of like this one a little bit better because it's horizontal. And remember, 7 is neutral. That would be like pure water. And then if we go less than 7 on the pH scale, we get more and more acidic. If we go above 7, we become more and more basic, or the other word we can use is alkaline, okay, or alkali there. So be able to understand both of these pH scales. And that brings us up to a second scale that we're going to talk about called the POH scale. The POH scale is based on, as you guessed it, the concentration of the hydroxyls, the OH ions, in a solution. But I want you to look at something right here. The pH plus POH scale have to add up to 14. So if I said we had a POH of 11, you would say, okay, there's 11 up here at the top, POH of 11. What have to make 3? So that means the pH scale, because 11 plus 3 equals 14. So the pH is going to be 3. And we should remember that a pH of less than 7 is going to be acid. Okay, so a POH scale of 11 is also going to be an acid. So look at this chart and just remember they have to add up to 14. Again, let's do another one. How about if I said the pH is 10? What is the POH? Exactly. It would be 4. And would this solution be acidic or basic? You got it. It is a basic solution. pH of 10, it's above 7. That is going to be a basic solution. Just be wary of this, guys. I've seen questions come up a lot on standardized tests that sometimes we'll use the POH scale instead of the pH scale. There's a hint because one may show up on your test. Now, this is important. pHs are extremely important in our bodies because our blood sits right about a 7.3 to 7.4. If we go much above a 7.3 or 7.4, our blood, we enter a condition known as alkalosis, which can be deadly. And if we go below like a 7.2, we go into acidosis, which also can be deadly. We have to maintain a very narrow pH range. And we do this by having buffers in our system. And a buffer is simply anything that can resist a change in pH or POH. Buffers have the ability to either take up an OH group and therefore make something less basic, or they have a possibility of giving off a proton. Okay? And if they give off a proton, they're acting as an acid, and that would help to reduce the pH. And if they give off if they give off a proton, if they give off an OH group, then they can increase the pH, make it more alkaline. So this is extremely important in our bodies. And as you can see in what happens basically is we start off, let's look at the diagram on the right. We have water and carbon dioxide. They come together and they form carbonic acid. So where would this happen in our bodies? Well, as your cells are undergoing cell respiration, they are giving off carbon dioxide as a waste product. And they have to get rid of that. So the water that's in your cells and in your blood plasma combines with the CO2 that your cells are giving off, and they make carbonic acid. And that carbonic acid will then travel through your bloodstream back to your lungs, where it will be given off again in the form of CO2 eventually, as you can see on the diagram on the left-hand side. So let's look at that diagram on the left-hand side, starting from the top. You have your cells producing CO2, okay? That CO2 gets picked up by your blood plasma, and your hemoglobin cells, that's the little purplish HB there, that'll pick up both CO2 and some protons. And then some of the CO2 will combine with some water inside your blood cells to make up some carbonic acid. The carbonic acid then disassociates. It gives off a proton. That proton goes up into the hemoglobin, and the bicarbonate ion then goes into the plasma, and that blood travels to your lungs. And in the lungs, the bicarbonate ion goes back into your red blood cell, and then it also, the hemoglobin at this point gives off its proton. You can see it there, the little HB in the bottom cell giving off the proton. That combines back with the bicarbonate ion to make carbonic acid. That's going to break apart to form water and CO2, and the CO2 will diffuse out and into your lungs. And that's how we get rid of our CO2 in our body. And you may think about why does this happen in these two different places? It seems like it's, they should be able to happen everywhere. It has to do with the relative concentration of carbon dioxide. We'll get into that in class a little bit. You don't need to exactly know all this details of this stuff, but I do want you to be able to realize that the CO2 is carried by your blood cells, and as is whereas the bicarbonate ion is going to be carried into your plasma and things. You may have heard of acid rain, and it was a big issue when I was your age, especially where I grew up in upstate New York, because of all the burning of fossil fuels, mostly from western and southern power plants, coal-fired power plants. And people didn't want the pollution to come around in their own neighborhood, so they built these really tall smokestacks. And that sent the pollution way up into the atmosphere. And the way the winds blow in the United States, it brought it all to the northeast, into the states of New England, the New England states and New York and things. And it decreased the pH of the rain, in some cases, all the way down to 2 and 3. And that low pH in the rain basically started to have adverse impacts on nature, and I'll show you a picture of that in a second. But luckily, this was taken. There was the Clean Air Act that was actually enacted by Richard Nixon, a Republican president. Basically led to the shutdown of a lot of the pollutants that were being given off by these power plants, and they had to put in all sorts of expensive scrubbers and things like that that removed a lot of these poisonous gases, sulfur dioxides and nitrous oxides and things of that nature. And our air quality is much better, and thankfully so. Some of the impacts acid rain had on plants was the destruction of, like I said earlier, the forest where I grew up in. You see all those dead trees. And also in the destruction of architectural elements such as statues. And my house was right across the street from a graveyard, a very old country-style graveyard, very small one, cows grazing in the background and things. But the tombstones there were so eaten away by acid rain that you could not read any of the dates. Now, some of the dates were pretty old because in New England, people had been there for a long time, and some of the tombstones were over 200 years old, but they were still very, very worn away. And this was a relatively recent phenomenon. Well, guys, that is the end of this lecture. And I do want you to remember that water molecules
are held together. The hydrogen and the oxygen are held together by covalent bonds. And because oxygen loves those electrons so much, the electrons spend more time around the oxygen than they do around the hydrogens, and that makes water a polar molecule. And so the type of bond that actually holds the hydrogen to the oxygen is known as a polar covalent bond. Now, what holds two water molecules together, or a water molecule to the side of a glass or to the tip of a straw, those are hydrogen bonds. And again, that's also a result of water's polarity. And hydrogen bonds, remember, are not covalent bonds. They're like a really weak ionic bond. So you may want to review Properties of Water, Lecture 1 again. And that's it. We'll see you in class.